Usaluka lida yukunu. Mabrika huni SANKOFA 16. Ikonye wakia yaka wamun woperito wa elino. Ikonye hahoma huni yakuno. Greetings, relatives, and welcome to SANKOFA. And on this celebration, we will be honoring the indigenous people of Jamaica, the Taino. I thank you all for being present. My name is Kalan Nibonrish Kaiman, Chief of the Jamaican Hummingbird Taino people. And to start off this day of information, of understanding, of acknowledgement and honoring, we'll start with the traditional Taino calling of the sacred directions. This for us is a way of connecting to our ancestors and starting our celebrations, of setting our intentions. So I invite you all to join. We start with focusing our intentions and attention towards the east. From the winds of the east, we call upon the medicine of the sun that rises and gives us an opportunity to start a new day, an opportunity to create anew. In Wahiani, or language, I will say, Wariko, Wariko, Wariakasi, Kiritima Ako, and Hankatu. And Hankatu. We turn to the south, facing the direction from our great waters. Wariko, Wariko, Wabonito, the spirit of the waters. We thank you for this opportunity to receive healing, healing that we garner from understanding, healing which we garner from truth that is spoken in a good way. And Hankatu. We turn our attentions to the west, the direction from where the sun rests. In this path, we call upon the medicine of the sunset, the medicine of Buyiri, the bat of Mukoro. We ask for the medicine of Okamatina, understanding and good hearing, and Hankatu. We face the direction of the north, calling in that medicine from our mountains, the medicine of Sibao, of Wahayona, of Hayana, the great chiefs from before, the medicine of our great leaders like Marcus Garvey, those who granted us knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to move forward in these times for liberation. We call upon the medicine of the hummingbird, of the doctor bird, which also deals with knowledge and understanding, and Hankatu. Honoring the earth, touching the earth, we call upon the medicine of Atabera, Mother Earth, Mother Gaia, all of our relations, all of our relatives throughout the globe that are connecting with us at this moment in time. Through touching the earth, we are being connected and aware of our connection with each other as earth keepers. And Hankatu. And finally, raising our hands to the heavens, Yaya Wature Yukahubagwa Marokoti, the great provider, creator, known by many names, the great mystery. We give thanks for this opportunity to connect, to share, to learn, and to grow. And Hankatu. And so it is. And now I hand over to greetings from Mr. Vivian Crawford, Executive Director of IOJ.
Thank you. Good morning. Mabuika, Mabuika. Hello, hello. That's a Taino word for hello, and the experts will perhaps say that that is not the correct pronunciation, but you know elsewhere we say pronunciation varies. Mr. Oliver Fagan, Chairman of the Board of Directors, African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Member Bank, Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, and other members of the board, including Miss Anya Thompson, Director, Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey. Chief Cacique, Kalin, Nimbonix, Cayman, Taino DNA. Presenters, Dr. Zach Robert, Professor Robin Woodward, and members of staff of Liberty Hall and of the Institute of Jamaica. Guests, including those on virtual links, members of the media, sponsors, ladies and gentlemen, students. It is my privilege, pleasure, and duty to offer greetings on behalf of the Institute of Jamaica, and we must congratulate the staff of Liberty Hall for their continuity of purpose in echoing the words of Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, a people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Special greetings must be extended to Mr. Oliver Fagan, the recently appointed chairman of the board of Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, and also the new director, Miss Anya Thompson, who they have both decided to join the organization for a time such as this. Let us put our hands together as we welcome them. We remember with gratitude those who served and are now at rest, including Dr. Donna McFarlane and Mr. Frank Gordon. We remember former directors, Mr. Kerry Brown and Mr. Bernard Janke. As we travel on our heritage lane today with our presenters, we are mindful of Taino retentions, including Ligani, Barbecue, Guinep, and Natto, and their two Zemis, their gods, which are now in the British Museum, presented there in 1799, and were identified at Carpenter's Mountain, now part of southern Manchester. The historians then said that they were found. I don't know if they could have been found, and they were not lost. Our Honorable Olivia Grange, our minister, has begun the process for repatriation of these objects. This is not show business, but in a sense today for us is show business. This is SANKOFA. It can be called show business because, as they say in show business, this is the moment we have been waiting for. So let the show begin as we call on our chairman of the board of directors, Mr. Oliver Fagan, to offer greetings. Mabuika, mabuika, mabuika.
Thank you and good morning. Mr. Master of Ceremonies, Chief Kasike Keman, our Honorable Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Honorable Olivia Grange, my preceding speaker, the Executive Director of the Institute of Jamaica, Mr. Vivian Crawford, Director of Liberty Hall, Ms. Anya Thompson, the Director of the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, and the staff of ACIJ, students at the secondary and tertiary levels, here and online, and of course, students of all ages. Good morning and welcome to SANKOFA. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you to the 16th staging of this most important event. This is not only a special occasion through which we discover and debate the numerous components of our rich history. It is also a living reflection of the ways in which human beings adapt to their circumstances. For example, 2 years ago, this event would have had more persons physically present than today. And so as we look at our indigenous peoples with a special focus on the Tainos this year, one of the things that I am sure we will discover is the means by which they made the changes necessary to ensure their survival and continuance. SANKOFA is also a platform of historical scholarship, where new discoveries serve to challenge widely held views about the people and events that we read about in our history books. And so I invite you to enjoy and to dive deep into this experience. As we examine today's topics, I want to urge that we see the history of the people who preceded the African presence in Jamaica as far more than notes to add to what we already know, or as facts that are pertinent and important for taking exams? Are there aspects of the lives of these Jamaican inhabitants that we can draw on as we make individual and collective decisions as a people of today and of tomorrow? That's the essence of SANKOFA, the core of what this special event is all about. It is therefore my hope that at the end of our time today, the Tainos will become more relevant and intimate to us, and the lessons about how they manage their society, their environment, their experiences of both peace and conflict will strengthen our knowledge about the bridge that connects the present and the past, increase our sense of community, and help us to fully appreciate our most important saying, our motto, out of many, one people. As we approach the official celebration of 60 years of independence, it is experiences such as SANKOFA that remind us of the sacrifice and the influence of the people who came before us, some of whom have survived to this day. We are therefore grateful for your interest in knowing more about our rich and intense history, and for seeing us as the critical conveyors of that history. Do enjoy. Welcome. Thank you.
Well said, Chairman, well said. Wonderful greetings brought to us here to show and to declare the intentions of this gathering, which is done in a good way, which is done in a way honoring those who came before us. So at this point now, we will have a short film which speaks towards lost history, rediscovering the Taino people.
When we talk about the Taino, few people even know what we're talking about. Everyone knows the Aztec, everyone knows the Inca, everyone knows the Maya. You mention Taino and they go, who are these people?
The name Taino itself is the generic term for the late prehistoric peoples of the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas, the Big Islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica.
In terms of national identity, the people in the Dominican Republic think of themselves as Indians, not as people of African ancestry.
These are the people that greeted Columbus. When Columbus arrived in the New World, there were several million Taino already here, living in the Greater Antilles.
Knowing more about the Tainos will help us understand that clash of cultures.
You have two worlds that didn't have previous knowledge of each other coming together and initially misunderstanding each other fundamentally because they are trying to fit them into the world as they understood it, when in fact this was something totally new and unprecedented.
There was a large number of indigenous population of Taino that were decimated, assimilated, or just disappeared within the first 10 to 20 years of contact with the New World.
Caves have a very special role in Taino culture. They are sort of the way that this world is physically connected to the underworld where the spirits of the dead dwell. The Tainos believed humans were created in two caves. The Taino people came from one cave, and all the non-Taino people came from another cave.
The Padre Nuestro complex of caverns is really 4 water-filled caverns and then several others that are land.
And it's one of only now 9 sites known with early stone materials.
When I look at Padre Nuestro, what I look at is its implications for the actual people in the Caribbean, which is one of the last places in the world that was inhabited. So 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, we know people came into the Caribbean. The question is, where did they come from? Probably the first wave coming into the Greater Antilles came from the mainland, probably Yucatan, by boat. Came across, inhabited Cuba, inhabited Dominican Republic, and we have evidence of that.
The Manantial de la Aleta, I think, has a special place among caves and caverns in that it has a very vertical, a direct vertical connection from a watery pool, a watery underworld, if you will, through the surface of the earth to the heavens.
And the only way you can explain these objects that date from 600 years before Columbus contact, right up to the time of Columbus, is that they were offered underwater and they were preserved there in an anaerobic, no oxygen, very little sunlight penetrating, and that's La Aleta. It has the largest diversity of Taino objects of organic and ceramic that we've seen anywhere else, and they were all placed there on purpose. They were all offered to the gods, the inner world.
What conception they have of broader world beyond that, we don't know.
Christopher Columbus was not an accident. His voyage into the New World were the result of many historical processes. By 1492, the last kingdom of Granada is won by the Christians. And it is actually at that point that Christopher Columbus is able to gain the support of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand for his voyage to the New World.
What he was looking for above all was to become the founder of a good family, one that would have titles and privileges and renown down through the ages.
When we think of Columbus's first voyage, I mean, everyone knows Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He came with the Nini, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. But not everybody knows that the first shipwreck of the Americas was the Santa Maria. And the Santa Maria ran gently up onto a sandbar reef in present-day Haiti. Well, they couldn't get the ship off the reef, so they had to make a decision.
Columbus was not able, with only the two smaller ships remaining, to bring everybody back to Spain.
They were able to actually use the materials from the now to build a fort called La Navidad.
And he left 39 men and he sailed off.
Columbus was of the idea that there was a lot of gold in that area. What he wanted to do was to have this fort over there so that they could start the trade with these people.
Everyone knew he was coming back. A little over a year later, he comes on the second voyage. He arrives at Navidad. What's he find? Smoldering timbers. Everyone's dead.
There was a doctor with the group who said they looked like they'd been dead about 2 weeks.
Columbus was thinking about trade, but the Spaniards were thinking about colonization. They actually started to demand some things from the indigenous people, and the indigenous people just did not accept that.
Most probably it was the local Tainos who essentially finally decided they had to get rid of these people because they were too disruptive.
So he knows not to stay there. He elects to go down the coast where he had sailed a year prior in a matter of several days. It takes him 30 more days to make it 80 miles down the coastline, and he pulls into a place, a river, the Bajo Bonico River that he had named, and he says, this is it. This is the settlement of Isabella.
They brought a priest, they brought some women, they brought animals, they brought everything they need for a full-fledged colonization.
The sort of backbone of the early Spanish colonial economy was the right to make demands on the labor of the Tainos.
If a Taino did not want to accept Christianity, that person could be enslaved.
One of the major sources of the writings of Father Las Casas.
He had seen actually in Cuba rivers of blood, of all the indigenous people that were killed, a massacre in the hands of the Spaniards.
They overworked the Tainos in the gold mines and the Spanish plantations. They took them away from their villages and their families at crucial points of the agricultural year.
From then on, we're going to see that there's going to be a major clashes, actually, in which many Spaniards actually died at the hands of the Tainos.
The trigger, at least as the story has come down to us, was when a Spaniard cut off a Taino's ear on a trumped-up charge of theft.
The Spanish show up with hackbutt rifles, crossbows, horses with soldiers with lances.
But I would say that the most important weapon against the indigenous people was actually disease.
There are accounts of at least some Tainos killing their children and then committing suicide rather than trying to face a world in which they could no longer cope.
The annihilation of the culture of the Taino and right in through the Americas is well documented as small amounts of Spanish made huge influence because of their arms and their weapons and their tactics. They were there to conquer. They were there to make a conquest.
If you look at the major transformations in human history, and I don't care, give me a list, a short list, 5, 8, 10, 12, I don't care how many. You have to include in that list the unification of the old and new worlds into a single world. After that, everything is different from the way it was before. People, plants, animals, diseases, ideas start moving all over the world in this sort of first great sweep of globalization, a word that's much bandied about nowadays. But the real globalization first occurs at the end of the 15th century. In a sense, they are the first people in the path of the hurricane. And they deserve our study and respect for that very reason.
He's a lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. Additionally, he currently serves as the president of the Archaeology Society of Jamaica and is a trustee on the board of Jamaica National Heritage Trust. His research focuses on the archaeology and heritage of the Caribbean at the prehistoric and historical sites, and principally colonialism and the diversity of human encounters in the emergent modern world. His publications include the co-edited collection British Forts and the Communities, Archaeological and Historical Perspectives. This was published in 2018. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zachary Beyer.
Is it okay? Just 1 second, folks. Thank you all, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Kasike Kalan. Thank you to the new chairman of Liberty Hall for this opportunity. A very respectful welcome to Liberty Hall, Jamaica, the online audience, and most certainly Indigenous peoples near and far. Again, my name is Dr. Zachary Beyer. I'm the archaeologist at the UE Mona. Again, thank you all, especially for the opportunity to present on during the annual SANKOFA celebration, following the spirit of Marcus Garvey. SANKOFA is an indigenous concept, meaning to retrieve, to go back. Archaeology, in many ways, retrieves and goes back, but oftentimes in an extractive manner. We dig, right, and remove from the ground. I'm hoping this presentation can not only outline what has been retrieved via archaeology as it relates to the indigenous peoples of Jamaica, but also what is provided via archaeology. And again, following the spirit of SANKOFA, one should remember the past to make positive progress in the future. One of the most powerful aspects of SANKOFA, I believe, is linked to the knowledge about history, archaeology, heritage, and we use those disciplines so we can know about not only ourselves, but the world around us, and ideally how we can better both. So I truly hope this presentation today can highlight some of those contributions from archaeology. So my presentation will roughly deal with some main questions around who were the first peoples of the Caribbean. I go farther back in time to discuss some of the formative migrations that the earlier documentary just highlighted. We will then think about what does the Caribbean look like on the eve of European Spanish contact, and what is Jamaica like during that time. I'm so very pleased to be joined today with someone that I know and respect very highly in her work. That's Professor Robin Woodward, and she will no doubt be providing more of the context of the Spanish experience and impacts in Jamaica. I'm going to go back even farther, mainly highlighting the foundation of human life in Jamaica, with a particular focus on the archaeology of White Marl, a site that has been known about for a very long time. A considerable amount of archaeology has been done there. There's been changes in how we've done archaeology there and how we've thought about it. These are some of the main issues that I'd like to highlight today. And I'll conclude by discussing the continuity of indigenous Caribbean people, not only in culture but in biology, as well as through our commitment in the present. We need not only focus on how indigenous peoples reacted to this hurricane, this onslaught of Spanish settler colonialism, of this emerging modern world. We also, right here in the present, have to be firmly committed to providing a space for indigenous voices, living indigenous voices, to be heard, and do our very best to preserve their sacred places on the past that are from the past that are currently under tremendous pressure and threats. So my discussion of who the first peoples of the Caribbean relies on a variety of historical sources. Archaeology, yes, documents, ethnohistory, recent advances in biology, so studies of ancient DNA, as well as living traditions, some of the knowledge that individuals like Cacique Kalan passes on in his everyday life on a regular basis. So just quickly, I don't want to trouble this section too much, but as we all know, this is where we're currently located. The Caribbean, a geographic entity spanning from northern South America to Central America around the Yucatan, and as well as up north, the United States, Florida. Archaeology reveals migrations taking place from the very beginning between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. And these are successive migrations of peoples bringing new forms of technology, new forms of knowledge, and new ways of adapting to these unique island contexts. We know that by around 2000 BC, based on the presence of archaeological evidence, ceramic tradition, well, prior to that, stone tool traditions, that many islands would have been settled by 2000 BC. Not Jamaica, and we'll talk more about that, but many of these initial populations had clear connections with Central America and coastal Amazonia. But these migrations did not necessarily follow a stepping stone pattern. It's quite remarkable that peoples in the past, as you can see on the slide here, in canoe technology were making large jumps, doing it multiple times, and not necessarily just, say, moving north from South America, making large jumps and actually migrating back down south. So quite remarkable, demonstrating the Caribbean as an important highway, not an isolated space made up of even more isolated islands, but a continent divided by water, where islands make up an integrated landscape of human life. And that highway has been studied by numerous individuals. Dr. Irving Rouse was a well-known archaeologist who focused a lot of his research right here in the Caribbean. And he outlined a 4-phase migration model that, while aspects of this have changed in my classes at the UE Mona, we very much still rely on this way of linking unique diagnostic types of artifacts to new movements of peoples, beginning first with the Lithic Age migration coming from Central America, marked by distinct technologies, flaked stone and blade technology that over time becomes less adapted for smaller terrestrial and marine animals, and less smaller blades. These larger blades coming from Central America, which would have been much more adapted for some larger terrestrial animals that we don't have over in the Greater Antilles. After this was another wave of migration coming now from South America, the Archaic Age, which is matched up with ground stone implements, mortars and pestles that would have been ideal for the processing of collected and increasingly domesticated plants. Following this wave is the Ceramic Age. And this is a diverse age where early on, initial populations coming from South America, known as the Saladoids, spread throughout the region into most islands, not Jamaica, marked by a very ornate decorative style of ceramics, white on red, painted ceramics typically. But this ceramic age included not only the Saladoids, but other peoples coming from South America, but also, interestingly, and I think as right here in Jamaica and Caribbean people, we need to embrace the reality that not everyone was coming on boats from other continents. They were developing here. As a result of migrations plus interactions can equal new indigenous formations. And that's what we see in the Greater Antilles, say with the Osteonoids, who later develop into the Tainos that we know today. In the Lesser Antilles, the Trumazoids. By the time of Columbus's arrival, two main groups are acknowledged, primarily the Taino and what are then referred to as Carib societies. We use homogenous universal terms like Taino and Carib when in reality we're dealing with very diverse societies than any historical accounts can relay. We're dealing with a rich mosaic of indigenous people that traveled along this important highway, shaped by diverse natural environments, migrations, cultural interactions, and social complexities. And the way that we've done archaeology, moving beyond Irving Rouse's systematic approach to linking special, unique types of artifacts to new waves of people, we are now using everything that science can provide us, right? Radiocarbon dating, computer modeling of seafaring, skeletal morphometrics, meaning that we're describing in detail and measuring the features of the human skeleton, mixed with isotope and DNA analysis. All of these are providing a clearer picture of just how significant the indigenous Caribbean peoples are and their deep histories. And we need advanced approaches. We need archaeology to tell this story, because we have not only an absence of conventional sources, but by the time of early Spaniards, we've got ethno-historical sources, and I'll show you some of those, that while useful are from a very Eurocentric and one-sided perspective. We need archaeology, living traditions, oral sources, in order to relay more of the perspective from indigenous peoples. So at the time, right around just before Spanish contact into the region, indigenous peoples throughout the Caribbean were experiencing incredible amounts of changes. This is prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. You see those later age ceramic societies, like the Osteonoids in the Greater Antilles, develop into larger, more socially complex chiefdoms with certain degrees of social hierarchy around chiefs, caciques, and other important peoples like shamans, behiques. But what you're also seeing is the increasing interaction between Greater and Lesser Antilles, along with ongoing connections with surrounding mainlands, again, resulting in a highway marked by just tremendous cultural diversity. And at the time of contact, as we already described, the island Carib are recognized moving into the Lesser Antilles. That's documented in ethno-historical accounts. The island Carib are often associated with a warlike, even worse, a cannibal type of perspective, versus the Taino of the Greater Antilles, deemed as more collaborative, peaceful. These are impressions that are being carried on from early European encounters, and again work to homogenize and limit the diversity and limit the realities of that these individuals were facing. So we need to do more archaeology in order to better understand these main groups alongside any other groups identified at contact, including those in Western Cuba, the Guanajara Bay, often believed to be the descendants of some of the first peoples coming from Central America. All right, as we've already described. But most certainly, the arrival of a new set of people from the old world now into their what they deemed as the New World, early Spanish settler colonialism, certainly set in motion a series of disasters for Caribbean indigenous people, including disease, economic disruption, famine, and forced labor. You'll see that this is, compared to the archaeology that we have from White Marl, that reality by way of European colonialism is far different than the life indigenous peoples at sites like White Marl would have experienced. All right, so quickly let's highlight a bit about what life was like around that time of indigenous European interaction. I'm only going to talk briefly about this because we're going to get much more detail from Professor Robin Woodward. Jamaica comes into European history in 1494 during Columbus's second voyage. He was reportedly told about the island of Jamaica from Taino Indians in Cuba, underscoring the knowledge indigenous peoples had about their landscape, had about the Caribbean highway. That despite being separated by open water, there was links, there was knowledge about this interconnected maritime landscape. After first establishing Hispaniola as a colonial base, you see the conquest of Jamaica by 1509. And we're going to hear more about that important site of Sevilla La Nueva, which is one of the first locations in Jamaica that you see the forced labor system of encomienda in action. As Professor Woodward will describe, no gold is immediately apparent in Jamaica, but Indian labor was transitioned for agricultural and cattle raising purposes, which resulted in a different situation for indigenous peoples on the island of Jamaica compared to other islands where mining perhaps was more intensive. More research is needed on Spanish Jamaica, and especially around the question of indigenous and Spanish interaction. You will see at the site of White Marl and other surrounding indigenous locations that likely would have been occupied during the first wave of European colonialism, that there's very limited evidence of Spanish presence at these sites, in contrast to a high presence of indigenous influence and material culture at these European sites. Why would you not have as much European materials and thus knowledge and culture at these indigenous sites? Perhaps this is a sign of resistance, a form of compartmentalization, where indigenous sites like Maima, White Marl, would have maintained traditions that they would have been, actively maintaining for over 1,000 years. So resistance need not be in the form of open warfare, like you can see on the slide here. It can also result from a distaste or a distancing based on choice of indigenous societies. So let's dive even more into Jamaica. Jamaica, its pre-colonial history, while it's been studied numerous times, it has yet to be published as much as other islands. God bless the work of Philip Allsworth Jones, Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, Ivor Connolly for their work on publishing, and David Burley, Professor Robin Woodward on publishing on topics related to indigenous Jamaica. More work is coming, especially based on recent evidence, recent work supported by the government of Jamaica at White Marl. Interestingly, and I made this point on several occasions, no pre-ceramic occupation has been identified in Jamaica. I always joke with my students that they're often late to class. Seemingly, some of the first Jamaicans would have been quite late, not arriving to the island until, based on present evidence, 550 years after the birth of Christ. And that first occupation phase, that first wave of migration, is marked by a distinctive form of ceramics, a distinctive form of material culture. And those are redware ceramics. They're painted or have a red slip on them, making them quite distinctive. This is a style of ceramic that has also been tracked to surrounding islands like Puerto Rico and segments of of the Dominican Republic. This initial migration wave was shorter lived. It was much in smaller settlements. It was likely an exploratory wave with peoples exploring Jamaica mainly along the coastline. And this is why these sites are quite small, they're quite limited, and they're usually right along the coastline, right? So climate change, unchecked coastal development threatens the earliest indigenous sites in Jamaica like never before. The second occupation phase, and this is where white marl comes into the story, right? And this is literally, it's marked by a unique and again, another distinctive form of material culture. This time ceramics, but unpainted, unslipped. They're bisque, coarse earthenware, round bowls, boat-shaped vessels, using a variety of different decorations, not painting, but punctations, incisions. White marl is a type site throughout not only in Jamaica, but throughout the region, where this ceramic style is associated with that site right next to the Mandela Highway, right between Spanish Town, Kingston, right in Central Village, the original Taino town. It's a very distinct, important ceramic style, but more impressively is the site itself, which we will talk about. But this second phase is these sites are not only located along the coast, but also more into the hinterlands on top of hills, a few kilometers away from the coast, and they often existed as almost satellites with interior coast settlements, larger settlements, matched with settlements located close to the coastline. So you can imagine Taino individuals moving between these sites for subsistence purposes, for interaction, trade, just a remarkable interactive landscape. The Taino in Jamaica, this is a people related, like I said, to Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico. They would have likely evolved from Ostionoid peoples by around AD 1200 or so. Tainos are generally associated with complex chiefdoms. But in contrast to some of the work that individuals like Irving Rouse and other Caribbean archaeologists did on Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, Jamaican Taino, early on in archaeology, the first half of the 20th century, were first referred to as sub-Taino, right? Because they lack some of the complex material spatial evidence that was seen in Puerto Rico, including ball courts, large settlements, plazas. But that was an unfair characterization. Now we mainly see the Jamaican Taino referred to as the Western Taino. But we'll talk about some of the problems that came from the early interpretation of Jamaican Tainos, just interpreting them based on what they lacked rather than what they have, right? And we're going to look at what they have over the next couple slides, okay? As I've already noted in a previous slide, there's no definitive evidence at sites like White Marl of clear Spanish contact and interaction, right? So Spanish glass, Spanish metals, Spanish foods, like animal bones. These aren't, and all the work that we've done at White Marl recently, we're not seeing that evidence, but we are seeing incredible amounts of indigenous material culture at early European settlements. And I know Professor Woodward is going to highlight some of that for us. What's also important to note in Jamaican pre-Columbian history is that these separate occupation waves that I mentioned, the Redware people, the White Marl people, you can see that as an archaeologist, we often turn people into these objects. That can potentially be problematic. But these redwares and then the White Marl style of ceramic, they typically don't exist together, meaning redwares, when we're digging, they're typically not located lower down, and then White Marl style on top of that, which would imply a certain level of evolution from one culture to the next. What we see in Jamaica, for the most part, are separate sites, redware sites along the coast, white marl along the coast and the interior, demonstrating you are likely dealing with related but separate people, distinguished based on characteristics and different time periods. All right. Let's think about Jamaica through the eyes of some of the earliest explorers, settler colonialists like Columbus, like Andres Bernaldez. His account, Bernaldez was on Columbus's second trip to Jamaica, and he described what was happening. As they entered the harbor, uh, uh, he describes so many Indians coming down that they covered the land and all were painted 1,000 colors, but the majority black and all were naked as is their custom. They wore feathers of various kinds on the head and had the breast and stomach covered with palm leaves. They made the greatest howling in the world, shot darts, although they were out of range. Bernaldez recorded Jamaica as a very mighty land beyond the measure populous, so that even on the seashore as well as inland, every part is filled with villages, and those very large and very near one another at 4 leagues distance, implying just the large population size of indigenous peoples in places like Jamaica. More recent DNA evidence is scrutinizing. It's checking those large population sizes that likely were blown out of proportion by these chroniclers. But most certainly what we get from Bernaldez is an impression of an intensively occupied, diverse settlement pattern, social organization, and alongside the technology of Jamaica's indigenous peoples. But we also get some misinformation. That's for sure. But let's dig deeper, right? And go back in Jamaica and go to White Marl, which many of you all drive up and down the Mandela Highway, likely on your commutes, your holiday, your weekend trips, and perhaps some of you growing up or years in the past even had the opportunity to visit the former White Marl Museum. This is an incredibly prominent place in Jamaica's prehistory and its ongoing indigenous legacy. White Marl is one of the largest Amerindian, indigenous Taino village yet identified in Jamaica. Based on present radiocarbon dating, radiocarbon dates organic materials like bone, charcoal, successfully, shell a bit less successfully. But based on those dates, we know White Marl was occupied somewhere around AD 900, all the way up to Spanish contact. The demise of White Marl is less clear. I will mention some evidence later on here that demonstrates ongoing occupation and continuity at a settlement like White Marl. As I mentioned, it's currently located along the old Spanish Town Road, Mandela Highway. It's located on the south coast of Jamaica, around 2.8 miles east of the Spanish colonial capital of Villa de la Vega, settled in 1533, which is now Spanish Town. White Marl is about 8 miles west of Kingston. The site itself would have been much larger originally. It's now been circumscribed and cut up and destroyed by a variety of different forces. But it originally sat on top of a hilltop in a perfect location. You can just imagine. Top of a hilltop overlooking the Rio Cobre and the Fresh River, which would have provided access to rich terrestrial resources as well as marine resources. So a fertile area for fish, shell, terrestrial animals like coney and iguana, even a bit of crocodile we found at White Marl, alongside intensive agriculture, tropical agricultural practices, the first farmers, right? The original site after indigenous occupation, you can see the bottom image here. This is a map of of Jamaica, of Jamaica, but mainly of estates, plantation estates, from 1730. You can see that dotting the area of White Marl here would be the estates later incorporated into the larger Caymanas estate. So that indigenous settlement would have been incorporated and modified and changed by agricultural operations, including sugar and livestock, by the mid 18th century. It's not like White Marl is a surprise. This shouldn't be new. We've known about it since the mid 19th century, and it has, but it's been yet to be fully studied. And that's a theme you'll hear me talk about time and time again. One of the first Jamaican naturalists, Richard Hill, was among the first to draw attention to the vast quantities of artifacts, animal bones, and human burials that had been exposed at White Marl during the initial construction of the Spanish Town roadway, which now immediately abuts the site. So we're talking here late 18th century, and an early report by J.E. Durden for the Institute of Jamaica in 1897 states this information. The IOJ was heavily involved with White Marl. Scientific archaeology was facilitated by the Institute of Jamaica. Some of the first scientific archaeology in all of the Caribbean, and most certainly right here in Jamaica around the 1950s under Robert Howard. Robert Howard completed a few field seasons here. One of the largest ones was in 1964, with permission, supervision of the Institute of Jamaica. Robert Howard unfortunately died the following year in 1965, tragically. What his work and others who followed Robert Howard, like Vanderwall, Silverberg, St. Clair, their work identified a complex settlement featuring dense archaeological records, ceramics, animal bones, stone artifacts, even evidence of the built environment, households, alongside those human burials. It is believed that White Marl, like other sites in the Greater Antilles, was likely the home of a Taino chiefdom, marked by increasing advances in technology and socio-political organization. But as I remarked, previous archaeology at White Marl defined it as less than the complex chiefdoms of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, and that was a problem. Since White Marl has been known, it's been both damaged and preserved by humans. Infrastructural development since the 19th century has forever limited the full size of White Marl. I mentioned the 19th century roadway. In the 1940s, that roadway was expanded, further damaging the site itself. But White Marl, the Caymanas estate, that section of it was gifted to the government of Jamaica, and they have, across the years, preserved sections of this site, especially with the development of the White Marl Museum in 1965. But you can tell from the beginning of my discussion, I focused on the Caribbean as a highway, and now I'm to the Mandela Highway, the road to White Marl, the Spanish Town Road, the Mandela Highway, is a significant route into Jamaican history, as well as Jamaica's deeper prehistory, but also the island's history of development and management of heritage resources. White Marl archaeology in the past. So the then, and then we'll get to the now. As I mentioned, Howard and company carried out some of the first scientific systematic archaeology in the 1950s and 1970s. As you can see from the images here, they completed comprehensive survey, mapping, stratigraphic excavations, deep excavations over 2 meters into the ground, as this profile is telling you, showing you successive layers of human occupation and the modification of that landscape by humans. They recovered animal bones, evidence of housing. You can see from an old map, they even identified an old burial cave that was cleared and studied in the 1970s by an individual known as St. Clair. This is from a publication in Jamaica Journal. So an incredible amount of work that led to the creation of the then on-site White Marl Museum and the Archaeology Laboratory in 1965. That site has left positive memories for many Jamaicans that I speak to who would have went to the site on a primary, secondary school field trip, went to the museum, walked around what was then an open air living history museum. So it was positive memories. And it was, when I talked to Central Village Chinatown residents today, it was a point of pride for them. From what was then an emerging community, the Central Village community in the 60s and the 70s. But there have been problems with that era of research. There's a lack of site maps. This map is useful to a certain degree, but we don't know where at this site that was approximately 33 acres, that has now been limited to about 6 acres, where in the world of that site this tremendous amount of excavation took place. We do not have a clear idea of context, which is a problem in archaeology. We don't just study objects. We study where they came from, their exact locations. That lack of site maps has been a problem. And as well as the problems with long-term storage of artifacts from the 1950s and 70s. The museum was damaged in 1988 by a hurricane, Gilbert. It was reopened in 2002 and then closed for good in 2008 due to a variety of issues. Those remains, those materials are not clearly known where they are, which combined with new materials would provide just an incredible data set to really make sense of White Marl. Philip Allsworth Jones, in his 2008 publication, when he talks about White Marl, he calls it a headless colossus of Jamaican prehistory, meaning we don't fully understand this site and we've missed opportunities to better understand it. Another problem with White Marl, the archaeology in the past, is how it's been interpreted. And I'm quoting here from Howard's early work from the 50s. He deemed White Marl and its archaeology as conservative, poor, stagnant, and peripherally retarded, possessing only limited interest in itself. These are impressions that aligned with popular cultural historical mindsets of the day that would have equated human complexity to advances in technology. So not a very good impression. Howard and his colleagues defined White Marl and Jamaican Taino by what they lacked rather than what they had. Many folks also have relied on models of complete extinction to understand the Taino, which is a myth first developed by early settler colonialists and then by later historians and archaeologists that has resulted in simplistic interpretations. But most clearly, problems with White Marl archaeology in the past was a lack of a public approach. Archaeology must be public. It must be honest and transparent, or we are just digging and extracting without giving back. We need, and there was in the past, there was limited attempt by not only archaeologists, but by government agencies to engage with broad sets of the public, especially Black populations in areas like Central Village. You can see that over time, White Marl has certainly changed. From the 1940s, that initial road, to the 1960s development. These are all aerial photographs to then today. Just look at how much community has developed around this site that would have existed all over this section of the slide here. Lasco, Winsinco is directly on top of major portions of the site. All we have left today is approximately 3 acres in the median, 6 acres, I'm sorry, in the median area. So let me just, and I apologize, I've already taken up a bit more time. Let's get to White Marl archaeology today. Recent work has responded to increasing development of the site, whether that's development from the surrounding corporate complex, from the highway, or the local community. It's an incredibly significant site, but the museum was abandoned in 2008, and it's currently unmanaged. Walking out there today, not only will you see a mixture of artifacts from 1,000 years ago alongside modern garbage, stray dogs, and roaming goats. And there's no tour guides. Best to have a guide from Central Village, because you can go to a site like that and discover the distant past on your own terms. It's quite beautiful, but also unfortunate. The site is surrounded by Central Village, which first emerged around the 60s and the 70s as an informal settlement that now has been plagued by a variety of social issues, including land ownership, lacking infrastructure, poverty, crime, and political violence. The old museum now, an archaeology lab, is now maintained by the Levy Academy as a church and a school for challenged students. They are the 21st century stewards of this site, and they must be encouraged to continue maintaining it. Archaeology in 2016 and 19, as I mentioned, responded to development plans. Rescue archaeology is not ideal. It's rushed. It's meant to just recover without taking the time that slow archaeology requires to make sense of everything. But we've tried to do our best, and this has been a joint venture under the direction and supervision of the Jamaican National Heritage Trust, individuals like myself from UWI-MONA, as well as students, as well as a host of international researchers, including from England, Leiden University, and more recently, Harvard University. We have been attempting to address some productive scientific questions beyond describing what white marl lacks, really better understanding what it has, while so trying to put the head on the headless colossus, right? And one of the important ways of doing that is making this archaeology public, literally placing Taino in a yad, Central Village as Taino Town original, opening up the excavations to community members, opening up the site for school visits, and then providing museum exhibits like what we did at the UWI-MONA for our 2019 research days, and at the UWI-MONA lab right now. This exhibit is available to share and be honest about this information. And that, I feel, systematic scientific archaeology plus public archaeology, that's how we're going to put the headless colossus on top of Jamaican history. So we've been out there rescuing Jamaica's indigenous legacy through intensive field work, deep excavations, collaborative work, JNHT, UWI-MONA, that not only is systematically mapping this site, but is also sensitively and respectfully excavating and documenting sacred remains, human remains, and cultural objects. And this is also providing opportunities for students to get involved and to get trained and become the next generation of Jamaican archaeologists and indigenous past preservers. We have done several projects that are addressing important questions, including lifeways and deathways. This research was recently published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology, and it focused on mortuary patterns, the different burial traditions of the Taino, ranging from fetal position burials with grave goods to seated semi-reclined burial positions, to even infant burials inside of ceramic pots. We're also conducting scientific dating, radiocarbon, so we can have a clear idea of just how long ago these individuals were buried. And dead people don't bury themselves. They were buried by loved ones. This was a community of life and death, right? Interestingly, one of the burials, this individual right here, dates to 1488, between 1488 and 1645, really demonstrating the reality of continuity beyond the point of Spanish contact. I realize I need to move forward here. We've also been describing more about human-animal relationships at a site like White Marl. The animal bones demonstrate a settlement that was very able to take care of their regular dietary subsistence needs, relying on a variety of terrestrial, marine, and animals. Coney, bird, fish, manatee, crocodile, iguana, crab have all been revealed. But one of the most interesting findings has been about the coney. And their conies are threatened, but they're still apparent in places like the cockpit country. It seems that Taino were managing these populations. They were killing prime age individuals while leaving juveniles and fully mature hutias, conies alive. And you can see that from the slide right there. Also, based on their stable isotopes, it appears that they had elevated carbon values beyond what would be expected from their natural diets, meaning that they're likely being fed, or at least they're eating the food that Taino peoples are throwing away. That's an important finding that will show up in a journal, the Journal of Caribbean Archaeology, likely later this year or next year. And then finally, environmental science at White Marl. We know that humans are heavily influenced by changes in the environment, but that humans themselves modify the environment by way of studying stratigraphic profiles and sampling these soils, identifying macrobotanical evidence like phytoliths that you can identify microscopically. We are seeing how the environment at White Marl was changed by humans, from an early environment of sparse vegetation and some grasses to then an actively managed landscape characterized by palms, crops like manioc and others, and a high level of charcoal, meaning they were burning and clearing areas. And then a final phase 3, which was more open grassland, which is likely connected to some of the impacts that places like Caymanas Estate would have had on areas like White Marl, industrial agriculture. We're dealing with a diverse polyculture subsistence strategy. They're not just relying on manioc, it's manioc, squash, laren, and number of edible palms. And just finally, and I do apologize for going over a bit, European colonization, did it result in the extinction of indigenous peoples? I'm of the mindset, and I know many in this room also are, that no, this was not immediate extinction. Within the last 10 to 20 years, many people throughout the Caribbean, the diaspora, are increasingly identifying as Taino. Others, often outsiders, feel this movement and that identification has nothing to do with the actual biological survival of the Taino. And while others, including Cacique Kalan, most certainly sees the extinction of the Taino as a myth, and their ongoing legacies in the present. We are in the process of conducting and adding biological information from ancient DNA to better understand who these people were and how, and the visibility of Taino in the Caribbean present, especially among Jamaica. So Jamaica Tainos arise most certainly. So thank you all for the opportunity to talk about Jamaica's pre-colonial past, White Marl, which is a very significant site and really holds the recipe for how we study, preserve, and manage Jamaica's past and indigenous heritage. Thank you all so very much and for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayer, a friend of the indigenous community here in Jamaica that has done a lot of work to support and bring to the awareness of our people today, of who we are, and to support and assist in allowing access to this information that is normally just, in that academic realm. So at this point now, if anybody here that is present that has any questions, an opportunity to put it forward. All right. Okay, so we have a comment here from Dr. Crawford.
We want to thank Dr. Bayer most sincerely for this very, very impressive presentation. And I want, on behalf of the Institute of Jamaica, to remind us that there was a Taino museum there, and sadly I was there the very day when it had to be closed because of violence. So the memorabilia are at the National Museum. But based on this impressive presentation, as I said, I'm asking this body, the Liberty Hall, African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, also the Institute of Jamaica, and to invite also LASCO. If we could have, please, Mr. Moderator, a Taino Day at White Marl School, a Taino Day, and I want to suggest, without prejudice, that the date be the day before Columbus arrived. So he arrived on the 5th of May, they said. The day before we call Taino Day, and every year we go to White Mall for this celebration, and we declare White Mall Taino Town. It's Taino Town. So if the moderator, the organizers are in agreement, this is something outside of this meeting, because the experts are here, Dr. Bob, Dr. Woodward, and all you experts. We should work on it so that when we are driving by, we say Taino Town, and we go and explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Crawford, for sharing that. And, I support that. I support that we really should bring more attention and get more involvement from our people here, As was said earlier in the greetings, that this event is about seeing what we can take from the past to bring forward. And this time that we are in the world now that speaks towards sustainable development goals, that is talking about net zero for 2050, if we can learn how to live in harmony with our environment and take those messages and guidance into the 21st century, I believe that we would all be better off for it. So at this point, I will call upon Derek Gray to introduce our next presenter.
It's really a privilege to introduce Dr. Robin Woodward. We actually go back from the 1980s because I met Robin when she came into Port Royal as part of the overall team from Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Texas A&M University. She was of course involved in the overall work at that time with Texas A&M and the project in Port Royal, understanding that site. From these early days, Robin had a very deep interest in Jamaica and Jamaican archaeology. So that she was able, when she saw Sibyl and Saint Anne, that she understood that this site, in fact, this site, as I said, is the Genesis, it's called the Genesis of the Jamaican people. And Robin was able to did her research first with a master's, and afterwards a PhD on the site itself, because this information was really needed for Jamaica and for us archaeologists to understand what was happening on the site. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I think it is important to know a little bit about her and the depth of her research. In 2002 to 2004, she did the re-excavation of the Spanish sugar mill, because this mill was excavated before, but a lot of the information on the site was not available. And she was able to do that excavation between 2002 and 2004. And in that excavation itself, and very importantly, she and her team was able to discover a workshop with carvings, which was, of course, our understanding was that it was the workshop itself, the sculptures workshop, was being carvings were being made for the church of St. Peter Martyr. Now remember that there were 3 churches in the New World. One in Dominican Republic, there was one in Puerto Rico, Capara, and the Church of St. Peter Martyr in St. Anne. So she was able to locate that church, but most of all, she was able to find that workshop. In 2009, she continued her excavations near the main road, and she actually found the remains of a slaughterhouse and a Spanish house foundation. But her research became even more interesting. And I don't want to go, as I said, I want to be as brief as possible, because she conducted the research on the Church of St. Peter Martyr in 2014 to 2015. Sections of it was exposed by the Spanish mission to Seville, but this church itself was exposed completely, and we were able to get a lot of understanding from this excavation itself. I should tell you that although we are talking about the Spanish period, we as researchers were trying to find where is located that they talk about the village of Maima, which was the village itself that Columbus saw when he came in 1494. And this has been years in, years out. We have been trying to locate. We have found bits and pieces of Taino occupation. But in around 2014, 2015, Robin was able to locate the Taino village of Maima. This is, of course, what she's going to talk about. So I don't want to go into much detail on that. But more than research, when the research was done, like for example, I remembered when the sugar mill was uncovered, she was very concerned that we could not leave the remains and the archaeological features exposed. So she was willing to make a contribution to ensure that we find a covering for the overall site. This, she was also concerned in terms of the church, when the church was found, and the foundations of the church, so that it could remain as preserved as much as possible away from the elements. There's so much to talk about Robin over these past 30, 40 years and the work that she has done on Seville. Do remember that what she will basically expose about this village, and this was a village that it is said in 1494 Columbus visited as the first European visitor. Her research has been very in-depth, and we know a lot about our first Jamaicans. It is no doubt. And please, I ask you to help me welcome a colleague, a friend, Dr. Robin Woodward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doric, for such a really kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. Great. And good morning, distinguished guests, Cacique Kalan, students young and old, and some of my fellow scholars who are listening in today. I'm really truly honored to be asked to speak to you today on the special SANKOFA conference in honor of the work and the spirit of Marcus Garvey. It really is truly an honor to be asked to speak. I also want to thank Zach Breyer for a fantastic introduction, really, to the Taino, their archaeology, and the landscape in which they occupied. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about my research at the first Spanish capital of Jamaica, Sevilla Nueva, more so here on the Spanish site than up on the site of Maima, because as Zach pointed out, on the Taino sites, we have very little evidence of the Spanish presence, but there is a huge amount of evidence for the Taino living within the Spanish communities. And that's what I want to share with you. And I hope at the end you'll have a much more nuanced view of the Jamaican Taino, their robust and existence during the time that the Spanish first joined, and certainly a more robust existence and longer existence than early archaeologists and historians have led us to believe. So without much more ado, I am going to start my presentation and dive right in. For the indigenous people and cultures of the Caribbean, the Renaissance voyages of discovery and the subsequent arrival of Europeans to the region initiated a period of rapid decline and cultural transformation because of the introduction of European disease, violent confrontations, enslavement, and crown-sanctioned labor. But just to simplify these initial encounters of into narratives of really conquest and devastation is really to ignore how the Taino responded to and were actually transformed by their interactions with the Spanish. Nor does it consider the many contributions that the Taino made to the development of a new cultural and social system that in the early decades of the 16th century during this contact period time. Far from being passive victims of conquest, then, the past few decades, archaeological studies of the Spanish-Indian contact period in the Caribbean has shown, notwithstanding, yes, the severe impacts of disease and enslavement, Indigenous people were active agents in the process of colonialism and engaged in a wide range of friendly, yes, and at times antagonistic social arrangements, including alliance making, trading, cooperation, intermarriage, resistance, and at times outright rebellion against the Spanish. Equally, for the Iberian colonists who arrived in the Caribbean, uprooted from their own homelands, they had to develop strategies to adapt to a wholly new environment, an economic and social reality that was very different from what they left behind in Spain to come when they came to the Americas. Research has demonstrated that depending on the duration, the geographic setting, and the context of these intercultural encounters, there was significant variation in responses both by the European settlers and also by the Taino. And my own research focused both at finding archaeological evidence, but also archival materials that would give us a little bit more evidence of coerced Indian labor within both the diverse residential, but also industrial activities that were going on at the first Spanish capital of Jamaica, Sevilla Nueva. The history of Jamaica and St. Anne's Bay in particular is elaborately entwined with Columbus and his heirs, beginning on the 5th of May, 1494, when he sailed into the bay on the north coast of the island on his second voyage, a bay that he called Santa Gloria, which is now known as St. Anne's Bay. And he returned to this bay in 1503 on his fourth and final voyage of exploration. He was forced to seek shelter with his last two ships because they were too waterlogged to make it all the way back to the island of Hispaniola. So he lived for a year in St. Anne's Bay, and he and his men enjoyed, as one would say, uneasy relations with the local Taino, on whom they relied for food. Columbus's eldest son was with him on that voyage, Diego Colon, and he kept a wonderful historic account of his year's activities, noting that the island was thickly populated and the Taino village of Maima was about a quarter distance or a quarter league from their beachhead where the ships had been drawn in. In 1508, then, Diego Colon, now a grown young man, is appointed the governor of all of the Indies, and in an effort to forestall erosion of his father's claims on the New World, he ordered a former military officer, Juan de Esquivel, to take 60 settlers over to the island of Jamaica, to Santa Gloria in particular, the following year. Esquivel's sort of charge was he was meant to be prospecting for gold to see if there was gold in Jamaica, but he was also to establish agricultural enterprises with an aim at producing supplies for the colonizing efforts either on the other islands or in Central and South America. And he was also to distribute land. So he got to work, he distributed land and indigenous laborers to some of his men through the means of the encomienda. However, rather than submit to this harsh labor regime, the sudden change in their circumstances where the Taino were forced to either build forts and houses for the Spanish or to work on their fields, many of the Taino rebelled against Esquivel. Several fled into the mountains, we're told. And in response to that, Esquivel rounded up some of the caciques, or the chiefs, and killed them as a means of subjugating the rest of the people, sort of to take the fight out of the rest of the people. And sadly, he was successful in his efforts. Once reports of his inhumane treatment of the Taino people reached the authorities in Spain, the king ordered a review of Esquivel's tenure, and in 1514 appointed a new governor, Francisco de Garay. Garay was not only a successful miner on Hispaniola, he was also an Indian slave trader, the former notary and chief constable of Santo Domingo. And in 1514, prior to coming to Jamaica to take up that position, he actually went back to Spain and entered into a partnership agreement with the king for the settlement and the economic development of the island of Jamaica. In 1519, this partnership was actually extended for another 3 years. Now, just prior to Garay's arrival in Jamaica, the authorities over on Hispaniola appointed a new treasurer to the island, Pedro de Mazuelo, who, of course, got to the island before Garay, and he quickly set about setting up his own power base amongst the island's Spanish residents. So when Garay arrived, there was quite a bit of initial tension between the two gentlemen. But Garay's experience as a fair administrator quickly won over the island's Spanish residents. And one of his first actions was to redistribute the Taino workers more equitably amongst the settlers, but also distribute many of them to the estates that he held in partnership with the king. During Garay's tenure on the island's role as the primary provisioning sort of marketplace for the colonization of Central and South America really began to grow. The settlement was profitable. The population, we're told, expanded quite a bit. There were new farming estates established to also produce sugar, to produce cassava to make bread, but also to rear sheep and cattle. And we do know there was a lot of sheep brought into Jamaica. Garai also established 2 additional settlements, we're told, and in a letter from the king to Garai in 1518, the governor was actually commended for moving the town of Sevilla Nueva a short distance away. Now, we as archaeologists over the past 70 years have not really been able to determine if Garai actually relocated this town, or if in fact he just moved some of the buildings back from the waterfront further away up the hill. We do know that one of his first things he did was to establish a sugar mill. This was the only mill on the island, and he milled the sugar for all of the rest of the settlers. And he was in the process of building a second mill in 1523 when he left the island to take part in the conquest of Mexico, where he died shortly thereafter. Not to miss an opportunity, of course, Pedro de Mosquera quickly reassumed the position of governor. And from 1524 to 1534, the economy of Jamaica seems to have gone really into a bit of a tailspin. It declined sharply. Fewer ships came to the island, making it very difficult for the remaining Spanish settlers to send their goods and produce to market. Further, Mosquera started to manipulate the affairs of the island during this period to the benefit of his own estates on the south coast of the island, i.e. he got the ships to come to the south coast instead of going to the north coast. And there were numerous complaints from the other Spanish settlers at the time about his misappropriation of their Indian labor, their food, their sheep, and monies from the treasury. Unfortunately, the authorities were very slow to investigate what was going on. And in 1534, the treasurer gained permission to remove the remaining residents from the town of Sevilla Nueva to a new settlement called Villa de la Vega, which is now Spanish Town, right near the settlement of White Marl that Zach just spoke about. And so the year of 1534 is generally taken as the accepted date for the abandonment of the town of Sevilla Nueva on the north coast. The British, as you all know, seized Jamaica in 1655, and the abandoned remains of the original Spanish settlement were gradually buried beneath the sugarcane fields of a large estate belonging to Sir Richard Hemmings. Today, this estate, you can see all the little yellow pins that I have there, is part of the Seville Heritage Park, which belongs to and is managed by the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. Many historians have noted that during the 16th century, Spain really squandered both the labor and the natural resources of the Indies, and in the process overlooked the commercial opportunities that Jamaica in particular and some of the other islands presented. By the second decade of the 16th century, the Antilles, the Greater Antilles, were really viewed just as a springboard for the Spanish, who were launching larger expeditions to the mainland continents around around the Caribbean. Thus, the fate of Sevilla Nueva and it really parallels many of the early settlements that the Spanish established in the Circum-Caribbean area, in that its existence was tenuous and really short-lived. Its fate was dependent on its ability to not only sustain itself, but also to develop a robust economy that would benefit the Spanish crown. Native labor, I think, was Jamaica's greatest asset in its early years, and harnessing this force to the benefit of the Spanish crown was really the raison d'etre for the colonization efforts on the island. Based on their previous experience on Hispaniola, the Spanish who came to Jamaica in 1509 were intimately familiar with the characteristics of the Taino chiefdoms and how to manipulate the Taino chiefdoms to their own advantage. Initially, the crown was really torn between this desire to care for the souls of the Taino people by converting them to Catholicism, and the need for them to work harder to produce either in mines or to produce food. So the authorities were somewhat reluctant to resort to outright enslavement of the native people to achieve their goals. However, they were not adverse to instituting the medieval Castilian system of forced labor known as the encomienda to achieve their ends. The encomienda was an institution through which the Spanish encomendero received a restricted set of rights over a specified number of Indian workers, whereby they could extract tribute from their workers in the form of goods, metal, money, or in fact direct labor services. In exchange, the encomenderos had to pay a tax to the crown, and they were supposed to protect their workers and pay them in a nominal way in the form of instructions in the Catholic faith and the Spanish language. I'm really not sure that the Taino considered this as a proper payment. The property rights, though, of the Indians prohibited the encomendero from buying, selling, renting their labors to other people. Further, they could not relocate the labor allotment that they were given to a new geographical setting, either across the island or to another island. And depending on the status of the encomendero, they could either just get a few workers or they could have actually a whole village assigned to them. And if it was a whole village, then the labor force was mediated and organized through the caciques themselves. In essence, then, the Taino were treated like property, and within their lifetime, there would be no release from this servitude. In the case of Jamaica, the only person who had the right to distribute the Taino was actually the governor, Esquivel Garay, or those that came after them. And most of the settlers that came to Jamaica in those first 25 years were in fact farmers from the lowest social category in Spain. So once they arrived in the New World and were given people to work for them, they actually had been elevated in social status far beyond what they ever could have achieved in their own homeland. Interactions between the Spanish and the Taino on these remote island frontiers took place, yes, through these formal institutions of labor like the encomienda, but also more informal ones through intermarriage or concubinage. The analysis of Aboriginals, the ceramics, the lithics, and the faunal remains that we found at Sevilla Nueva has provided a greater understanding of some of these processes and how they worked to shape the society of this early 16th century town. The exact location of Sevilla Nueva was actually discovered by chance in 1937, and but the formal excavations of the site didn't begin until Charles Cotter started in 1953, and he worked there until 1968, mostly on weekends because he was a planter and an avocational archaeologist. But over the past 70 years, archaeological excavations have shown that certainly the coastline has been modified greatly in the last 500 years. You can see the white area there is the 16th century coastline, where the blue, out to the blue, is where the current coastline is in St. Anne's Bay. And our research has shown that the Spanish remains actually are quite diverse. They're very well preserved, but they're actually buried under as much as a meter of alluvium soil. Despite the extensive archaeological programs, investigators have yet to determine the full extent of the town of Sevilla Nueva, and if, in fact, it even had sort of a nucleated center of this community. We seem to have found things scattered quite far afield. All of the Spanish features, though, are on the narrow flat plain, which is bordered in the north by the Caribbean, by St. Anne's Bay, and on the eastern side by the Church River. All the Spanish features except for the Church of St. Peter Martyr, which is the Abbey, and it is up on the hill on the east side of the river versus being on the west side of the river. Certainly during his 18 years of excavation, Cotter really concentrated firstly on the castle and then the excavations of the sugar mill, which he found. But he also did surveys of the area, kind of looking through wherever it had been plowed up to see if he could find more Spanish remains. And you can see all those little red X's around the island highway there. Those are where he found deposits of either Spanish brick or tile or ceramics, but he did not investigate those during his lifetime. They were, however, investigated by Simon Fraser and myself with a team from the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, both in 2004, 2008, 2009, and then later from that as well. In 1981, as Doric said, was my first year coming to Jamaica. That's me as a graduate student up there at the front. I took part in a survey of the Seville estate when we were looking, about to start a project to look for Columbus's last two caravels. That's me with Father Osborne. And I analyzed the ceramic and faunal material recovered by Charles Cotter that had never been studied, and that was for my master's thesis. I did, at the invitation of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, return to Jamaica in 2001 to investigate the sugar mill complex for my PhD dissertation. And in 2002, we encountered a sculptor's workshop and brickworks adjacent to the sugar mill. And between 2004 and 2016, a joint SFU JNHT team completed the excavation of this workshop and undertook a systematic search of the rest of the fields to see if we could find the extent of the Spanish settlement, and in particular, find some Spanish residential features. We had the fort, which was from the upper class, but we wanted to see how the regular Spanish settlers or colonists lived when they came to Jamaica. Dr. David Burley from Simon Fraser surveyed the field south of the highway. First, he thought he'd found a large house, but now we realize, very quickly, we realized this was a large Spanish slaughterhouse or butchery. And he also found some adjacent dwellings to that. Field testing, certainly south of the highway, has shown that there are a number of dwellings in the South Field. And Dr. Burley also directed the excavations of Maima with one of his graduate students and myself. And Maima is up on the hill west of the Seville Great House. In 2014 to 2015, as Dr. Gray said, I did excavate the Spanish Abbey, the Church of St. Peter Martyr. It was located by Father Francis Osborne. And this is ongoing research I am currently doing, and I'm hoping to have a major publication ready for the 500th anniversary of the first Spanish Abbey in the New World, which will be in 2024. Unlike most of the early colonies in the Caribbean, the economy of Jamaica was based entirely on agriculture versus mining. And certainly it was based on, as we've seen from the evidence at the butchery, that sheep was the major thing that the Spanish raised here, but also cattle and pigs. And this was for the production of salt meat and leathers. And they also farmed sugar, maize, cotton, and cassava to make bread for export. During Garay's tenure, we do know that the colony certainly had a degree of prosperity. This is evidence from these fantastic Spanish plateresque early 16th century carvings that were done and found both in the workshop. These, the completed ones, in fact, were found in the well of the governor's fortress there. In particular, the sculpture and a large amount of Spanish maiolikas, glazed earthenwares, were found in room number 1 of the Spanish fortress, or the governor's fort there. And it really is representative of an elite status of the occupants of that particular fort. There were, however, 1,797 sherds of Taino ceramics were recovered from the fortress, primarily from the smaller room 2 there, and that represented 64% of the ceramics from that particular feature. And it is all of the white marl phase of the Western Taino people. Most of the sherds really were nondescript body sherds, but the presence of Taino cooking wares in an elite Spanish household is an indication that Taino women were being employed as domestic labor at the site. Even more indicative of the presence of Taino women at the fortress is the presence of a large amount of these ceramic griddles, cassava griddles. And cassava bread made from the root of the bitter manioc was really the mainstay of the Taino diet. Now, we do know that the Spanish really did prefer to eat bread made from wheat and European grains, but wheat, as we also know, does not grow very well in the tropics. So they were forced really to adopt to eating the local equivalent, which is cassava bread. And cassava doesn't go stale, and it doesn't mold. And so the Spanish quickly realized that it was the ideal rations for both sailors and for the conquistadors as they moved further west to the mainland. And so they had Fernando Oviedo, who wrote an incredible account of life in the Spanish Caribbean in 1535. He wrote a complete description of how the Taino women produced cassava bread, the types of tools they used, including manos or hammerstones. And we found a number of those hammerstones were found in room 2, along with the cassava griddles. Within the fortress, then, there is a clear separation between the Taino ceramics and food preparation technologies. They're all found in room 2, while the ornate Spanish earthenwares, tablewares, and architectural decoration was found in room 1, so that they could really maintain their Spanish lifestyle for really sort of the public viewing, while in the back rooms was where the Taino elements were found. So there is a clear separation between the two activities. While more locally produced Taino ceramics were widely used for cooking wares at most of the Spanish sites within the Caribbean, it is evidence from the presence of just 39 sherds of a distinct Colono ware that was found at which we call St. Anne's Bay, and this was found in the governor's fort by Charles Cotter. That certainly the Taino ware wasn't appropriate for the Spanish to use as tablewares. So they basically, Jamaica being the most windward island of the Greater Antilles, was really poorly accessed or poorly served by the Spanish ships. So it was harder for the Spanish people on Jamaica to be able to get imported wares and goods and foodstuffs from Spain. So they forced the Taino through their encomienda labor to produce pottery that was in Spanish style for them to use, Spanish tableware style for them to use. And they also forced them to change the way in which they made ceramics. We do know that gender roles within the Taino society were probably non-exclusive, but contemporary chroniclers seem to say that it was the women who were making the pottery into Taino society, and this was done using the tradition by hand. They didn't use a wheel, and they made it through hand coiling. And we know that the certainly that the St. Anne's Bay ware is made with this roughly the same material that the Taino white marl ceramic is used, with the addition of a little bit of sand temper. Now, the sand temper helped the ceramics be able to have hotter materials in them, which was more suitable for the Spanish style of cuisine. So, and the both the goblet and the jug are quite a bit thicker than the regular Taino white marl ware. So they have totally adapted or changed the way that the Taino were made. It was still being made by the Taino people, but it was changed to suit both the Spanish style and the way that they use them. There was also a number of small Taino bowls that actually had a triangular wedge put on the bottom. So unlike the Taino round bottom bowls, the St. Anne's Bay ware bowls wouldn't rock back and forth on the table because they had this foot ring. The faunal assemblage at the Governor's Fortress and was overwhelmingly European mammals. In fact, 99% of the faunal material from this feature was dominated by pork, by sheep, and by cattle. Only 1% was local deepwater fish, and there was absolutely no examples of endemic birds or hutia in their foodways. So a completely European diet. It was also highly fragmented, showing that the meat had been boiled or stewed up versus being barbecued, which was the traditional way that the Taino ate their food. So in this way, there is a partial adoption of European culinary techniques by the Taino women who are working within the Spanish fortress. And it really provides this new dimension of our understandings of the types of accommodations that the Taino ladies in particular had to make while living in Spanish households. In 2008, I did some test sites west of the butchery, and that first one marked number C in the lower right there. I did find a number of Spanish ceramics, roof tile, brick, and some faunal material, enough to indicate that this was probably the location of a Spanish house. This excavation was expanded in 2009 and revealed quite a large kitchen midden, but also a foundation trench and a barrel well. The foundation trench is probably the sill of a house, small house like this. And these excavations like these have been sensitive sort of indicators at other sites of a modest Spanish dwelling. These people just had a barrel well, where a well dug with a series of barrels going down in them to support the walls of the well, versus the one at the governor's castle, which was beautiful vaulted brick-lined well. These people couldn't afford to do that. So this is a dwelling of a much more modest Spanish resident or colonist there, person of lower social status, which was exactly what we were looking to see, how the different households adapted to living in Jamaica. But interestingly enough, there was still about 65% of the ceramics that came from the site were also Taino and represent roughly the same equivalent. So we do know that Taino women, even in this modest household, were being employed as domestics. There was also a number of very small chert flakes recovered in this excavation, and a shell scraper. And these small blades were used for cutting vegetable fibers, perhaps scraping scales off of the fish, and scraping cassava. And these are everyday domestic activities that the Taino women would have engaged in if they were preparing food for that household. The butchery, the sugar mill, and the adjacent workshops provide a completely different arena from residential features for us to look at a different set of social relations between coerced Indian labor, the Taino, and when they were working alongside European craftsmen and the sugar technicians. And archival records did state that there were there were Indian laborers assigned to work on farms, helping to raise the animals there and for harvesting crops. Additionally, in a letter dated to March of 1524, the king notes that over 14 years, the Spanish on the island had been successful in training a number of the natives, were taught the rudimentaries of masonry and brick making, and were employed in the construction of houses and the fortress there. The presence of Taino men in the archaeological record of Sevilla Nueva is much less visible than that of the women who were working in societies, as they were mostly assigned to do manual labor on the peripheries of the settlement. And as I said, we haven't actually found all of the settlement, and we know that they were working on farms. We haven't found those, but those employed in the butchery and the quarry or the workshops there would have been using European tools for their tasks that they were doing. That is not to say that the Taino men were completely invisible, because in fact they're not. We did find a number of hand tools, these manos, these hammerstones, and a number of chert blades and cores, and the archival record, which really supports the archival record of saying the Taino men were working in the industries at Sevilla Nueva. These are not fancy chert tools. They're just expedient tool technologies, which was very common for the Taino people. These small blades of locally sourced chert were used for scaling and processing fish, for cutting vegetable fibers, as I said, but also to make rope and to cut the palm fronds that they used to make which they used for the roofing, not only of their own houses, but clearly the roofing of the workshops that the Spanish had. You can see where I've got the arrow to the ash level down in the bottom shot. There was a huge ash layer, a very distinct ash layer, and lots of charcoal, which you'll see at the top, that was surrounding all of the Spanish carving that was in the workshop, indicating that there had been a fire. It's probably just as soon after the workshop had been abandoned, and it was probably a thatched roof. We found very few roof tiles here, so it was a thatched roof, like the illustration there. That was it was an open thatched workshop that they were having, and it's burned, created a lot of ash around it. And certainly the small tools that we found would have been appropriate for making thatched roofing. There is evidence of food being consumed around the mill and the workshops in this industrial quarter of the town. There is very little evidence, though, of cooking activities taking place in the immediate vicinity. Unlike the governor's fortress, there was very little differentiation in the Spanish pottery. In fact, there was really only these small white bowls, which called escudillas. There was one base of a plate and one base of a small jug. That's it. There was only these little white bowls, mayolica bowls, which is a common form of Spanish tableware in the early 16th century, and really more commonly associated with something the working man would have used. And we have a number of these, and they were both used for drinking and for eating, and this was clearly the case in the mill. The distribution of the Taino and Spanish ceramics at the workshop area shows that there were two distinct areas where food was consumed. The first, and all the pottery, all the sculpture was done in the center of the workshop, and food was just consumed on the outer edges of the workshop there. Unit 24 at the top there is where we found most of the Taino wares and most of the fish bones and a little bit of pig bones, but not much, but only Taino ceramics were found there. While over in units 34, 35, we found a lot of, that's where all the Spanish material was. It's where the rosary beads were, the whetstones to sharpen tools, and a lot of European food remains there. So it appears that there's really two distinct areas where the workmen are eating the Taino or on one side up on the northwest part of the workshop, while the Spanish are eating and consuming their foods over on the eastern periphery of the workshop. There were also 11 glass beads found by Charles Cotter at the mill. We found just the 4 or 5 chevron multicolored beads at the workshop. And clearly, Spanish trade beads were found at some, but not all of the Spanish sites in the Caribbean. Clearly, they're used as a form or medium of reward or exchange with the Taino people. Now, some of the early Spanish chroniclers noted that the Taino women were really accomplished weavers of cotton. And cotton at the time of contact was growing in wild in Jamaica. And the women processed these fibers for the production of nets, for making hammocks. They made belts and loincloths for themselves to wear. And the Spanish introduced sheep to Jamaica. And we do know that documents say that woven cloaks and cotton shirts were an export item that came from Seville and Nueva. Production of textiles then is clearly another activity wherein the Jamaican women are involved within Spanish industries now, not just domestically, but into the industry through the agency of the encomienda. So they weren't just domestic workers, they were also assigned to do some of the work chores. The recovery of just a single spindle whorl there, it's actually made from a repurposed piece of Spanish maiolica from Columbia plainware, and offers some evidence, initial evidence, that this industry was going on, as the documents said. So despite the Crown's concern about the welfare of the Indians and requests that they should not be overworked, the early economy of the Indies was based on forced exploitation of their labor. Though Seville and Nueva existed only for 25 years, I think the effects of European disease, forceful subjugation, and social abuses that occurred as a result of the encomienda were no less destructive to Jamaica's Taino people than they were elsewhere in the Caribbean, although archival records, because they were only farming for the most part, seem to note, it does note that there is a rapid decline, but there are continual mentions of the Taino surviving well into the early 17th century here. It is widely assumed that most of the adults of working age spent a considerable amount of their time away from their villages in service of the Spanish on Jamaica. And our research does confirm that both Spanish men and women participated really in every facet of the Spanish community at Seville and Nueva, both in their economy, but also in their domestic arrangements. So, and this existed well beyond the life of the town. The Iberian population of Seville and Nueva, like many in the early Spanish Caribbean settlements, was largely made up of men. Very few women came to the Caribbean in the first century. Less than 10% of the immigrants to the New World, Spanish immigrants, were women. So very much they incorporated the local Taino ladies in either as wives or as their concubines or servants for domestic activities. They were an essential part then became an essential part of Spanish society at every level. And you could see this right from the governor's house right into the house of the Spanish peasant over by the Spanish farmer who lived over by the butchery, that the women were working at every level of Spanish society. The production of cotton cloth and certainly the Spanish women then, both through their participation in the Taino women in the Spanish households, it's very much the influence is going from the Taino to the Spanish because they're making the Spanish adapt to the Taino lifestyle, but also the Taino cuisine for the most part because they weren't able to get all the types of food. But then when you see the production of the cloth and the St. Anne's Bay ware, you see that influence going the other way from the Spanish to the Taino versus the Taino to the Spanish. So a very robust connection between the interaction between women and the Spanish men. Likewise, in the archaeology of the sugar mill and workshops, it does support the archival record that men were working for the Spanish, but is very much more in the other direction from the Spanish to the Taino, in that the Taino were forced to adopt the use of Spanish tools and technologies to perform that labor. You just see a little bit of the Taino being able to maintain their own personal foodways when they worked within the Spanish community. There's certainly a diverse array of Taino cultural materials found in association with the Spanish features at Seville and Nueva, and it really demonstrates this engagement was both continuous, robust, and very varied, and has helped us really gain a much more nuanced understanding of that interaction between the Spanish and the Taino. And also understanding the cultural transformations that occurred through the agency of the Encomenda. In closing, I just want to thank very much, acknowledge the great support that I had from the Jamaica National Heritage Trust throughout all of my years in Jamaica. And I'm indebted to their diligence, the skill and hard work of their staff. I'd like to make special mention of Dr. Doric Gray, certainly for helping me. He helped me direct and get staff, and also Edward Coor from the JNHT because he did all of my illustrations. I'm also indebted to Dr. David Burley from Simon Fraser, not only for his assistance and guidance through the years, but also for supplying me with graduate students and funding those graduate students, not only to come to Jamaica, but funding a number of graduate students to do advanced research on DNA studies and ceramic studies up at Simon Fraser. I'd also like to thank Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby for her invitation to contribute to her many publications that she has done on the Jamaican Taino, and the soon-to-be published one that Zach referenced, a special edition of the Journal of Caribbean Archaeology, which will be dedicated solely to the Jamaican Taino archaeology. And finally, in closing, I'd like to thank Ianya Thompson, who is the director of Liberty Hall, for inviting me to speak with you and share my research today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation, sharing so much to bridge that gap in knowledge. You know, when this started, there was a presentation that talked about lost history. When it started, there was a presentation about lost history, rediscovering the Taino people. And I would love to see at some point if this panel, this discussion that we had here, is put in film form and shared with youth of different varying age groups so that they too can have this information that is so enriching to the spirits of not just Jamaican people, but all Caribbean people, to learn of that spirit of resilience that we have and we carry and we walk with. I'd like to take this opportunity to really shout out to those that are viewing on YouTube and really hail those that I see the comments are coming in. So Patricia Parchment, I'd like to give you a big up. and thank you for coming on board and for watching and for viewing. Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, Mabrika Witu, Mabrika, greetings our sister. Thank you for supporting this event and coming on board. I see comments here from Maxine GP saying, very informative, happy to hear of the efforts with White Marl. And definitely that is a discussion that we'll take up after this forum based on the declaration from Mr. Crawford. Going through here, I'm seeing more comments coming in. This is wonderful. Courtney Ladley wishing us a good morning. He's from a part of the a radio show. So there are a lot of opportunities for connections, and I see our relatives connecting from Ontario, Canada, her home. Thank you for that as well. So at this point, we will have the acknowledgement and closing by Miss Anya Thompson, Director of Liberty Hall. And I'll just leave some more comments with our audience before we go into that as Mr. Fagan had said, the whole theme of SANKOFA is to learn from the past and to bring that forward. And I think here on the island and in the islands in general, at times we forget about that heritage and the gifts and the blessings that we have. You know, we have some of these food ways, we have some of these practices, some of this mindset and this temperament. And it's for us to honor it. There's a short story that someone had shared with me, true story, that in the 16th century, Nigeria received cassava. And in their process to learn how to utilize cassava, there were several outbreaks of cyanide poisoning. While we have never had such an issue here on this island because we have that heritage of working with this indigenous food. The lead producer of cassava and cassava products in the world today is Nigeria. So there's a lot of benefit in understanding these ancestral ways and moving forward with it. So if there's any questions from anyone here on the floor. Okay. We have a question from Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Kessie. Yes. And to thank Dr. Woodward for this robust presentation. Sorry, since food is the staff of life, we have not been highlighting the Taino cuisine to any extent in Jamaica apart from barbecue. And you spoke continually, Doctor, about bread, cassava bread. Is it the same thing as bami? Or is it another kind of bread? What?
No, cassava bread is what you call that.
Okay. Is that now? And you spoke about the corny. Now that is not. I know I am from 1066, but in my childhood in Moortown, Portland, I used to have the coney meat. Oh my heavens! So I was very pleased when you spoke about it. They caught it at night and they used dogs to catch the coney. And for the uninformed, it looked like a rat, but it didn't have any tail. and we enjoyed it. It was really cooked with peas because peas was in abundance, gungo peas and red peas, and 99% coconut juice, and a green Scotch bonnet pepper. Oh my heavens. I can't wait with the support of this group to have the annual Taino Day. And without prejudice, Dr. Woodward, you and Dr. Baer, we have to have a room dedicated to you both. God bless you. Thank you.
Gratitude.
Well, I look forward to coming to the first Taino Day, which should be celebrated on May 4th. If Columbus arrived on the 5th, we should celebrate it on the 4th, and I look forward to coming and celebrating with you.
So, without further ado, Miss Anya Thomas, Director of Liberty Hall.
So let's just clarify. I'm not married, so it's not Thomas. It's Anya Simone Thompson. Thank you all. I want to say thank you all. This has been an exceptional presentation. Master of Ceremonies, Cacique Kaiman, give thanks. With the pomp and ceremony that you started our proceedings with, I definitely know you set the tone. So thank you. I want to especially thank our Executive Director of the Institute of Jamaica, Mr. Vivian Crawford, for his greetings, warm greetings, and attendance. I'm humbled to be a part of your team, sir. Thank you, Mr. Oliver Fagan, Chairman of ICIJ, for your fundamental introduction to our SANKOFA lecture. You set the stage, actually, superbly. Thank you. Thank you to the staff of IOJ, IT, in particular, and others for facilitating our presentation and ensuring its success in collaboration with Visual Tech. Thank you. Special thanks to our presenters, Dr. Bayer and Professor Woodward. Your presentations allowed us to SANKOFA. The art of looking back, SANKOFA. The art of looking back with both an investigative nature and keeping an open mind. It's also applying the art of critical thinking while retrieving that information. Knowing where we come from advises where we go. And as a people that boasts out of many one, as a people that boasts out of many one, learning about the peoples represented on our country's coat of arms is just another step in retrieving and understanding our collective history. Special thanks to Faith Anderson, our research officer at Liberty Hall, and the entire team at Liberty Hall for executing this production flawlessly. To the students and the general attendees, welcome and thank you for watching. I look to the months and the years ahead as Liberty Hall emerges from the COVID shutdown and reconvenes efforts to connect with the broader community, perpetuating the legacy of Marcus Garvey via our multimedia museum, library, and digital archives. We will be more active on social media, engaging the public via our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram platforms, as you will note, because we are now streaming live on YouTube. Please look out for regular programming. I would be remiss if I did not use this platform to mention or to address the exoneration efforts of His Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, underway February 1st through March 2nd, 2022. As you can see on the screen, we do have a link, justiceforgarvey.org, and you do have until March 2nd to go online and sign the petition. It would be quite a feat by the Jamaican government, by Mr. Julius Garvey, His Honorable Marcus Garvey's son, and the Marcus Garvey Institute. It would be such a feat to actually exonerate Mr. Garvey. As you all know, it's something that it's been ongoing efforts for quite a while. So again, please go online, sign the petition, and again, I want to say thank you so much for attending SANKOFA, the 16th staging of SANKOFA. Last note, refreshments will be served.